I signed out of the hut with a dull pencil and the kind of care that comes when the page is damp and the letters want to fray, then shouldered the pack and let the door find its own quiet. The ridge was a dark thought above the tussock, and the clouds sat on it like wool laid over a bruise. Early winter has a particular smell here, damp peat and tin from old rain on rock. And I took that in as I ran the quick check I've done more times than I'll ever admit aloud. Beacon where it belongs, radio warmed in the inner pocket, map case sealed, axe leash good, bivy folded tight against the back panel. I told myself the day would be simple if I kept the task small and honest. We were to cross the pass, inspect the far bivy box and the old avalanche signage that never quite stays where it should, then drop to the valley shelter before dark could press the snow shut. The track through the leatherwood kept its usual arguments, branches that pretend not to move until your sleeve finds them. I counted the familiar orange flashes of marker paint without calling the number, letting rhythm stand in for mathematics. The wind somewhere above me breathed in long-held notes, a choir you can't see because the singers are stone and ice and the breath itself. That sound has company if you let yourself hear it, the starch rub of map plastic against jacket shell, the gentle click of the axe ferrule against a buckle, the small news on the radio as it shifts in its pocket. I set my stride to the grade and let the muscles take their old jobs. Routine is a shelter if you keep it aired. At the first stream, I knelt to drink from the bottle and checked the bridge of tussock and stone that would carry me without getting ankles wet. The water ran clean enough to show the sky's pale underbelly as it hurried. I looked up to pick my next line and found the ridgeline exactly where the map said it would not be. The angles were right and wrong at once. The spur that should have thrown a shoulder toward me had retreated, or the printed contour had stepped forward on the page to pretend knowledge it no longer owned. I held that thought and did not let it sharpen. Paper moves in damp, eyes move in memory. I placed the bottle away and climbed. The bush thinned into alpine scrub, and I felt the wind put its hand on the pack as if to measure me. It did not shove. It rested, as if matching the shape of what I carried to some pattern it already knew. I have stepped into wind that simply takes, and this was not that. It was an assessor. I moved a little more to the right, aiming for the patch of rock that would give me a clear view into the basin where the cornice often grows early and refuses to be reasoned with. I kept the axe ready and the pole in the other hand, and if I spoke aloud, it was only to repeat the simple names for what I saw: slab, crust, windskin, safe edge. When the cloud lowered, it did not fall as a wall. It braided itself around the pass and began to hum. That is an unhelpful word, and still the only one I own for it. The pitch changed when I angled the map case, a small rise like a whistle when the plastic caught the breeze. I stilled it with my glove, and the tone shifted lower. It is reckless to grant meaning to voices in wind, so I did not. I named materials: polyethylene, paper, ice crystals. The sound is physics. The way it leaned toward me when I brought the edge of the case parallel to the ridgeline was also physics. I breathed through that habit of naming and made a small test. I rotated the case to line the map's grid to the compass baseplate inside the sleeve. The wind's whistle steadied and then climbed. It felt like a bearing sung by a mouth that had waited a long season for an ear. I stowed the case against my chest to cut that noise, and the world softened to boot crunch and breath. For a while, that was enough. The steps found rhythm, and the slope allowed it. Then I smelled salt. Not the blooded tang of new metal, not the cold stone smell of rain on rock, but wet salt such as a wave leaves inside wool, hung on a porch rail. There is sea on every horizon of this place if you climb high enough, yet you cannot usually taste it at this height. I stopped without making a plan to stop, and let the air move across my tongue again. There it was, faint but correct. Carried on a line that did not match the weather's stated direction. I stood with the axis of my shoulders to the slope and let the scent find me from a notch off to my left. The map told me that notch would be a clean saddle on a windy day. The wind told me that saddle was a mouth. I keyed the radio and gave the sort of update that would settle any desk mind hearing it. Nearing the pass, visibility changeable, wind from the quarter, we like least but manageable, no significant movement underfoot. I did not add the smell and the song. When the reply came, the voice at base had that warm knit a person gets when they picture the hut and a kettle and you, a dot in a weather advisory. A brief request followed. The far bivy box has reported a latch issue. If I could check and tie it shut for the week, that would save a trip by someone who cannot spare it. I said yes because that is the sort of agreement that keeps a crew whole. The climb into the pass became a lesson in small angles. I learned the cadence of the wind's change as the cloud thinned and thickened. When the map lay flat against my chest, the tone was low and steady. If I let the top edge lift, the note climbed as if I had put a mouth on a bottle and asked it to speak the way a child does. The proof of my own senses is never enough for procedure. I needed another cross-check. I took a knee behind a jut of schist and ran a finger under the map sleeve's lip to open a small vent while the case stayed flat. The tone eased upward anyway. That was not a cavity whistle from the plastic. It was the air itself finding shape in a line that matched the blue grid the printer had given me. I closed the vent and eased out from the rock. The snow under the windskin had that dry squeak that tells you it will take a step well and also give it back to you with interest when it slides. I tested with the axe shaft and found a layer that rang like a drum in one direction and soaked the point in another. The mountain was a library of thin pages laid on top of one another, and the binding wanted no stress. I chose the long traverse rather than the direct chute, because I am paid to bring people home and to keep the job uninteresting. Every dozen heartbeats, the wind made the map sing again despite being tucked away, and I chose to think of it as memory, or the echo of the first anomaly, rather than a fresh instruction. Near the crest, the world narrowed. There is a type of cloud that does not blow by. It lives where you stand. It lends a low sky to your head and moves the land only a little when you ask it to make sense. I arrived in that room and felt the fieldcraft tighten in my hands the way a rope does when a partner leans into it out of sight. I set the axe spike and made patient steps, testing, listening. The hum steepened, and I could not tell if it came from the case, the hood brim, the space between my teeth, or the pass itself. A pattern arrived. When I faced a direction that matched the drawn route, the tone settled. When I drifted to the side, as a cautious person does, in white, the tone leaned into a higher register that made the skin at the back of my neck remember childhood alarms. I apologized to nobody in particular and followed the lower tone. On the far side, I found a short-lived clarity, a thinning of cloud that gave me a slant of the basin I needed. The cornice line had grown a pale lip beyond where I would have guessed from feel alone. I corrected my mental map and let the relief be quiet. The wind took that moment to press against the pack with a steadiness that felt like a palm guiding a page over a desk. I allowed a few steps more than I meant to, then stopped cold because the smell returned, stronger now, a tidal scent, kelp and rope and the iron of wet chain. I had crossed passes where spindrift tastes like ground glass. This was harbor air at height. I stood there with the axe point dimpled in the crust and counted the places the sea could throw its voice this high. The answer was unkind to logic. There was no fetch toward the coast from this aspect, no clean line for a channeled current of air to climb without breaking itself to pieces on ranges before me. I let the radio wake and thought better of it. I drew the map case out and held it at hip height. The tone answered with a clear, thin note that matched the direction of the smell rather than the direction of safety. I lowered the case and the note stayed for a breath after, as if the air were finishing a measure it had memorized. The bivy box waited somewhere below, the latch possibly loose, the roof always a little too light for what the wind thinks is fair. Duty is a line that keeps a person from wandering, and I took hold of it. I set my traverse into the lee, marked a safe shoulder with the axe, and began the descent by memory, which is another way of saying by trust in the small decisions that have earned their keep. Behind me, the pass kept singing in a tone that had learned my map. Ahead, the valley smelled like a place that should not be able to reach me, and yet it had already arrived. I told myself the oddities could travel with me without owning me. I told myself that more than once. I descended into the lee with the axe close and the case flat against my chest, so the song would stay quiet. The cloud broke and cinched itself by turns, a curtain on a rail that sticks. I picked the old waymarks out of habit, a rust stain on schist where a guide wire once lived, a knee-high tussock that kept its color under rime, a gouge in the bedrock shaped like a layman's arrow, pointing not where you should go but where a boot once slipped. The wind did not leave me, it changed its manner. In the hollow, it cupped my jaw and cheek with the careful touch of someone trying to turn your face toward a view. I refused that courtesy and kept the compass where routine says it belongs, even as the baseplate gave a sly nudge to match the pull of the air. When I tried to ignore the lure, the map case, though pinned under my jacket, found a thin note anyway, a whistle like a kettle far away in a house you think is empty. The slope carried me down to the snow bridge that spans the basin's small drainage. Bridge is generous. In early winter, it is more faith than structure, and it teaches patience if you let it. I tested with the axe farther back than pride prefers, and felt the layer beneath respond with a low, drum-like hollow in one direction and a confident firmness in another. I took the diagonal that treated both with respect. While I crossed, the wind tugged at the pack in a steady rhythm that matched the map grid I had memorized before leaving the hut. It was as if someone traced each faint blue line with a fingertip and paused where the contour made a neat bend. It is not my habit to grant wind a finger, and I did not do so now in any way that would stand up in a report. I named slope, aspect, drift lanes, and I moved. Halfway to the small knoll that overlooks the bivy box, the air changed enough to bring the salt back with conviction. It had learned company, rope tar, and kelp rot, the lift of gulls I could hear without hearing. The radio clicked in its pocket, with the restless energy of something about to speak, but I left it alone. Across the basin, a darker seam ran through the whiteness like a page creased by a heavy hand. It was not rock. It was snow hardened by a stern lesson in yesterday's wind, a place that would carry weight until it refused to, and then not at all. I adjusted my line to skirt it, setting a stake with the axe each step, and keeping the pole's tip in the snow like a listener's toe tapping out a slow rhythm. At the knoll, I stopped in the shelter of a low rib and let the breath settle enough to think. The bivy box sat below on its stilt legs as it always does, painted the color committees choose when they want rescue to be straightforward. Even from here I could see the latch had sagged, so the lip of the door did not meet the frame. The wind from the pass braided down and found that lip, turned the door into a mouth that opened and shut on phrases too soft to carry. The box talked like an old person dreaming. I gave the wind a small job to keep it busy. I held the case out low and flat and rotated it. The tone rose and softened in a pattern that matched a bearing toward the notch where the salt had announced itself. When I faced the box, the tone leveled and thinned until it was barely a thread, not gone, only patient. I stowed the case and let a minute pass with no tools moving. The hum stayed, detached from plastic or jacket edge, and I felt it in my molars like weather. The descent to the box had that trick you get when habit meets white. The distance seems shorter than the work you've done, and the track of your own steps behaves like a partner who can be trusted until they cannot. I reached the stilt ladder and knocked the rungs free of ice with the axe head, as if waking an old acquaintance. Inside, the box smelled of foam pads and damp plywood and the tales of meals that people eat when the plan is changed. The latch had lost its spring, and the strike plate had worked loose. The wind had been nursing it like a loose tooth. I found the tie-down cord and worked a figure that would hold without biting the wood. While I tied, the radio roused itself with a tone that did not belong to it. Then the speaker cleared with the dry page hiss I know from snow static, and bass came through with a line check and a reminder to report once I'd finished. I answered in calm words, added that the latch was secure for the coming week, and volunteered that the wind was throwing odd harmonics in the pass. The reply was a chuckle wrapped in weather hedging, a kind person telling me that wind sings where wind finds an edge, and to keep the song from choosing my feet. I signed off and let the formality close. I ate a mouthful of something dense enough to keep thought steady and uninteresting. While chewing, I noticed the printed emergency card on the inside wall had shifted under its tack. The corner lifted exactly when the wind's note peaked and lowered when it dipped. The gap was the width of a fingernail, no more. I pressed it flat and stood. It lifted again in time with the unseen breath outside. Evidence asks to be measured. The rules forbid bringing untested measurements into a mind that must make decisions. I compromised with myself. I stood beside the door, held the map case open with one hand like a book, and slid the radio between the plastic and the paper so the antenna pointed up through the sleeve's thin opening. The wind found that edge and wrote a clear tone that climbed as the antenna aligned with the pass and dropped as I turned toward the far valley. The change was clean as a tuning fork. I closed the case and put everything away as if nothing had happened. I wanted a second sign that did not depend on ears. Outside the box, I crouched and studied the snow scrawls that wind writes low. You learn its penmanship after enough seasons. Tiny cresting waves where it combs, sharp chevrons at obstacles, flat polished bricks where it packs slabs for later. In front of the door, the scrawls formed a faint corridor that pointed not to the known descent, but to that notch the map marked as no more than a curiosity. Down that line, the surface had a faint sheen you see on beaches when the tide is drawn back, and left rope marks in wet sand. I touched it with glove tips. The cold bit my fingertips through the fabric, in the way salt water does when it dries in wind. I smelled the harbor again where there is no harbor. Duty is not a wall. It is a narrow path that asks you to keep one boot in the world as it was planned and the other boot ready to test. I took my boot to the path as drawn. The traverse toward the regular descent cut under a bank of wind-rolled snow that held a quiet tremor if you stood too long. I moved with the care of a person carrying glass in their ribs. The pass hummed behind my shoulder like a wire under tension, and I worked to refuse its rhythm. Yet every time I gave my attention back to the line, I found that my steps had drifted a handspan toward the hum without my consent. I corrected and corrected again. The mountain accepted the effort without gratitude. At the edge of a small gully, I knelt to test the bridge with the shaft, and heard an answer that was not in the snow. A low knock sounded under the surface and moved away along the gully, picking up speed like a tap running along ducting in an old building. I held still and let the sound go. When it reached a bend and slid out of hearing, the wind lifted my hood a fraction and the map case spoke one clear syllable I could nearly transcribe. I did not. I folded the hood away from the ear and waited to see if the knock would return. It did, softer, as if coming back on its own track, failing to find me exactly, and passing just to my right where I had been a minute before. It is not useful to invite pattern when patterns live here already. I invited patience instead. I retreated from the gully, crossed higher, and gave the slope the respect it had silently demanded. By the time I took the safer spur down, cloud had changed its mind and the light came through with that thin, radiant quality that erases distance while leaving edges crisp. The salt lifted, softened, returned. I kept the case still and the radio quiet. My hands had that reliable ache you get when metal and cold agree on a price, and the axe leash left a narrow pressure on the wrist that I will feel when I lie down. Under the ache sat a keen awareness that the day's simple job had grown a layer I could not note in any log without sounding like I had given the weather a vote. I would not do that. I would report latch work completed, route as planned, visibility inconsistent, wind changeable. I would add a line about avoiding the gully on the return due to poor structure. I would not mention the smell of the tide riding at height or the way the map learned to sing itself in the pass. When the valley head finally gathered itself below me in the honest curves I remember from summer traverses, I let a breath go I had been renting. The shelter roof showed through the manuka like a tin scale on a shy animal. The sea scent folded into the ordinary notes of wet soil and winter fern and old water. I looked back once at the pass. Cloud sat on it again, thick and unremarkable, as if to say that all the singing had been in my own head. The urge to believe that is strong in any ranger worth a wage. I let myself believe it for a handful of steps, and it felt like leaving a worry on a stump for birds to pick clean. Then the wind in the valley caught a thread from far above, and braided it into the smaller breezes among the shrubs, and the map case at my chest gave a last thin whistle, pointing toward the notch that does not belong to us. I did not follow. I followed duty and the trail that keeps crews whole, and behind me the air made a promise I could not hear clearly enough to accept or refuse. The valley path took me toward the shelter, the way good sense likes, but a day does not end when paper says it should. The sky held that thin light that flattens distance and makes a person believe they are nearer than their legs know. I checked the door of the valley shelter anyway, gave the hinge a courtesy wipe so it would not freeze sulking, and stood there long enough to admit I was stalling. The radio sat quiet in my pocket, content with a job reported clean. I should have warmed my hands and written a line about latches and visibility and chosen rest. Instead, I stepped away from the tin roof and faced the wind that slid down from the pass. It met the map case through my jacket with a subdued note that felt like a pencil pressed to the inside of my ribs. The smell of the sea hid, then returned in a small lift of air that threaded manuka leaves without moving them. I thought about the notch and the dark idea of a mouth high on the ridge, and about early winter cornices that pretend patience until you ask a question they do not like. I carried the axe as if it were older than me and I were borrowing it. The pole I strapped down, because vanity likes a free hand and caution likes one tool at a time. The climb back toward the pass felt like walking into a choir practice behind a closed door. The notes muffled, the pitch still correct. When I paused in the lee of a rib, the wind reached around and aimed my chin the way a patient mentor does when you have been looking at your boots. I refused that help, and stood with shoulders square to the slope, telling myself that the next choice would be made from ground, and not from air. The basin opened to the right, the notch sitting low and unremarkable if you did not know what your teeth had already learned. Beyond it, the cornice overhung a line of shadow where the slope rolled away without courtesy. I took the long traverse that would bring me above the notch, while keeping a shoulder against schist where it showed. The snow underfoot was a quilt of old lessons and fresh insistence. Thin windskin that hissed, packed tiles that squeaked when you asked too much, soft pockets where a boot could sink and pretend surprise. I tested with the axe shaft each step and counted the breaths between tests in a rhythm chosen to be dull. The case hummed low when I held to the drawn route on the paper and lifted to a clean thread when I drifted toward the notch. For a while, I let the hum be weather. Then I made a decision shaped like work. If the wind had found a way to write lines across this basin, I would read them like any track and decide if they belonged in the log or only in a pocket of the mind. The approach to the cornice asked for humility. I eased upward on a diagonal that kept me away from the lip and stopped in a shallow scoop, where old spindrift had packed itself to a calm. There I knelt and pressed a glove flat to the surface. The cold pushed back in a gentle burn that always startles on the first contact. I listened without hearing, felt without telling myself a story, and made the small tap we use when we are alone, and need to know whether the snow is harboring a voice. The sound came back delayed and thin, not the healthy thump of a slab that simply wants to be left in peace. It carried a faint edge, the way a pot sings just before it lifts lid. I shifted 2 hand widths and tapped again. The echo arrived faster, as if the page under me had fewer layers. Between the 2 points, the ground held a seam I could not see. I moved off the scoop to a rib of scoured snow that had collected grit and mica flakes, good purchase under a boot. The cornice lip loomed without form in the cloud's shy light, and I found the edge by the absence of sound more than its presence. The basin fell away beyond the lip and breathed in a slow, secret way that makes a person want to lean closer. I did not lean. I lay flat and pushed the axe ahead, letting the head nose onto the overhang the way a cautious animal tests a plank over water. The shaft picked up a tremble from my pulse, then added a tremble that did not belong to me. I drew it back and listened, and heard the wind answer with a whistle that matched the tremble's cadence. That is not a phrase for a report, but it is what I owned. The map case came out because craft is not a prayer. I opened it as little as I could and held the baseplate inside the sleeve, keeping the grid near my chest so the plastic would not chatter. The wind found a hairline gap and wrote a note into it. When I aligned the grid with the notch, the note climbed clear and true. When I angled away toward the safe traverse, the note dulled as if I had put a mitten over a mouth. I thought about what base would say if I spoke this aloud. I thought about the far side of the range, and the way storms stack like books waiting for hands. I told myself I would gather one more piece of evidence, and then pick the conservative line because that is how I keep a job. I crept along the lip a cautious distance back from the edge, far enough that the cornice would not take my question as an insult. The wind slackened, then pressed, as if someone tried different keys to match a tune. At the spot where the basin curved toward the notch, the air shifted to the flavor of salt and old rope, with an insistence that ignored the height and the shape of the land between. I let that pass through me and kept the axe hand steady. That was when the surface under my left forearm sighed. It did not crack in anger. It exhaled like a sleeping thing turning over. A hairline settled across the snow between me and the lip, and I felt the way an idea can find its shape in a fraction of a heartbeat. I slid back in a single motion, low and plain, and the line stayed a line rather than a mouth. The retreat carried me into a pocket of softer drift, and my elbow sank, pitching the case forward. The sleeve filled with spindrift, and the plastic edge sang a bright, childlike note that cut through my ribs. I covered it with my forearm, and the song kept going for a breath, as if the air did not need plastic anymore. I let the case hang, put both palms flat, and crawled on a bearing that memory tells when paper gets damp. The axe bit into the scooped snow where I had knelt earlier, and the echo came back with the clean certainty a person can stand upon. I stood. I needed to choose, not in a dramatic way, only in the way that holds a day together. The conservative line would take me away from the notch and deliver me to the gentle spur that feeds the valley. The curious line would track the wind singing toward that low cut, where the sea had no right to speak, and see if the mountain had written something there in a script I could read without inventing letters. I am paid to bring crews home and to keep the log clean. I am also paid to notice changes that maps cannot print fast enough. I keyed the radio and gave base a simple update in a voice that knows how to keep rooms calm. I said I would make a short inspection of drift patterns near the pass to confirm the state of the cornice before the next party comes through. I did not say the inspection would bring me near the notch. The reply wished me a quick look and a safe step. I took the short line. It was not dramatic. I moved as a ranger moves when alone and under watch of weather, one careful placement at a time, testing, correcting, giving the slope every chance to refuse me before it took me. The wind's note rose and fell in ways that matched nothing I could draw but everything I could feel. At last I came to a shallow saddle where snow writes long sentences, and the world lowered around me into a quiet not made of silence. The note settled into my jaw like a memory, and the smell of tide came clean and then was gone. I crouched and pressed my palm to the surface. The cold bit, then numbed, then told me the snow would hold so long as I moved with the patience of a person reading aloud to a tired mind. Ahead, the notch showed itself not as a door, but as a page margin where someone had made small marks I could not yet see, only sense the habit of the hand that had made them. I set the axe into the shoulder of the saddle and let my eyes soften until the wind scrawls wrote their faint commands. They pointed where wind wants to go when wind pretends to map. They also pointed where the conservative route keeps you alive on days not like this. Both sets of marks were present, layered, and at odds, and I understood that clean choices are often rehearsed in huts and not given on slopes. I tightened the strap across the case, thought briefly of the bivy sack and how it would feel if the day grew longer than planned, and made the smallest commitment a person can make that still counts as a choice. I would follow the scrawls that matched duty until they met the ones that matched the song, and I would stand there and listen with every craft I owned before putting a boot into what passed for tomorrow. I moved along the saddle until the scrawls braided tight and told me I had arrived where two ways disagreed. The conservative track fell off to my right in a line of honest work and dull consequences. The other followed the wind's handwriting into a pale notch, the map called Nothing Special, and my teeth had already named. Cloud closed so gently, I did not mark the moment, only felt the light thin into a sameness that robs edges of their jobs. The white room gathered around my head and waited to see what I would do. I set the axe a short reach ahead, eased weight, and listened with the patience of a person handling glass. The snow spoke in that dry whisper that marks windskin over something less certain. When I tried to picture where the slope should roll, the memory slipped. The map case at my chest grew faintly tense, as if the plastic wished to speak through jacket and wool. I told myself a small truth aloud to keep the mind obedient. We will take 10 patient steps on duty's line and see if the song follows. I put one boot where the scrawl said the slope would forgive me and made the count in the ribs, not in the head. The path held. The hum slid closer like a chair on boards in another room. At the 10th step I stopped and let the air pass through. The smell of salt softened and left behind the mineral note of schist and the faint wool scent of my own sleeve. Duty's line felt safe and unremarkable, in a way that makes a ranger protective of boredom. I could have followed it all the way down and written a report of latch work and varied visibility. Instead, I made a small test a training officer would begrudge and a field partner would understand. I faced my shoulders toward the notch and lifted the map case a hand's width from my chest without opening it. The hum rose clean and thin, the way a kettle announces intention before it boils. I stowed the case and rested the hand on the axe head until my own pulse ran slow. The white room kept its hymn. In that kind of light, a person must become narrow. I moved as if threading a needle that did not agree it needed thread. The world reduced to the triangle between my boots and the axe tip and the sound of my breath. Then the hymn found a second voice. It was not the plastic, not the hood brim, not the little gaps a jacket permits when you lower your chin. It came from the snow itself under my right knee, a mouthfeel of tone that vibrated through fabric into bone. I shifted, and it drifted to follow. I thought of pipes in old huts that sing when the wind crosses their mouths. I pictured a mouth in the pass made of nothing but air and contour. I denied all of that in the part of me that carries reports to base, and I kept moving. A flake of grit winked where the white thinned, and I knew a scoured rib lay close beneath. I stepped to it and let boot rubber find purchase on a crust roughened by mica. There I felt safe enough to take my glove off and press skin to the surface. Cold made an honest argument with my fingers and then dulled them. In that flat contact, the vibration grew clearer. It was steady until I turned my wrist toward the notch. Then it climbed. I set the glove back on, flexed until feeling returned, and put the PLB where my hand could find it without looking. I did not intend to use it. I only wanted the comfort of its weight, named and ready, in case the day priced itself too high. Somewhere above the cornice cupped to the wind, and threw it back at the basin in a pattern the map grid had been trying to teach me. I crossed a faint drift lane, and the crust underfoot sang a single bright syllable like a glass struck by a spoon. That note ran outward along the surface and faded as if distance had teeth. I made a mark with the axe to remember not to trust this patch in a thaw, and stepped off it at an angle that satisfied both prudence and a longing I did not care to approve. The notch grew not by sight, but by habit, the way the air wanted to place my chin, the way the hum found a pitch that made the skin at the back of my neck recall childhood warnings, the way my steps narrowed of their own accord. When the lip of the notch revealed itself, it did so in absence rather than in shape. The storm had planed the top into a soft roll, then carved a shallow throat where wind hunts a small victory. I lay prone and sent the axe ahead until the head hung over nothing, then drew it back until weight came home. The smell of tide returned plain and clean, and with it a rope tar breath and a hint of kelp that does not travel inland unless carried by stories or weather that breaks rules. I think of myself as a poor host for stories when they fight the rules that keep crews whole. I stayed a poor host and let the air move past without permission. The radio uncurled inside my jacket with a little stir, as if it had also heard the sea and wished to say it did not. I opened the case only enough to slide a hand inside and square the baseplate to the paper. I did not take the map out. I held the case like a shield against my chest and turned the whole of me in small degrees while keeping my belly on the snow and my boots dug into the rib I trusted. The tone answered each shift with indifference until my shoulders lined with the invisible throat of the notch. Then it sharpened. I whispered the task the way I do when it steadies me. Confirm consistency, seek cross-check, avoid invention. The cross-check arrived not in sound but in drift. The wind scrawls at the edge of the throat bent inward and then out again in mirrored fans, a pattern I know from beach flats where the tide runs in two minds. Snow does not draw that way unless air has learned to breathe from two directions and met here to argue. The argument had written a corridor a person could follow down into the basin if they wished to measure consequences. I did not drop in. I am not hired for theater. I chose the safer shoulder and angled along its upper edge to look down the throat from the side. In the white, the throat became a tunnel, more felt than seen, a place where sound tightens and other senses wonder if they have done their work correctly. Somewhere deep, the knock I heard in the gully returned, softer now, moving along a line that matched the corridor the scrawls had drawn. It passed below my boots like a small animal running for cover, and then faded as if it had entered water. Nothing in front of me held water. The air smelled as if it did. I backed away from the lip and took a knee where the slope trusted me. The hymn quieted. The world widened by a hand's breadth. I made the sort of notes that pass in a log without raising eyebrows. Drifting complex near pass saddle. Cornice developing in arcs rather than a continuous lip. Scoured ribs providing reliable anchors. Avoid throat adjacent to notch due to uncertain structure and possible venting. I did not write venting. I wrote variable loading with acoustic evidence of hollows. I nearly wrote coastal scent anomaly and then folded the pencil back into the pocket because not every truth needs to be on paper to be kept. On the way out of the white room, distance misbehaved in small, teachable ways. A spur I have crossed in other winters took longer than it should to arrive, and the low rib where I had rested earlier came up early, as if it had been waiting closer than before. The case stayed silent while pressed flat. It found a ghost of tone each time I rolled my shoulder to ease the strap. I kept the bivy sack where I could reach it, not because I planned to sleep, but because the day had a habit of lengthening in a way that makes warmth a decision rather than a comfort. A Kia called somewhere below, 2 plain notes and a laugh, and the sound came from the wrong quarter given the wind. I told myself slopes throw voices the way buildings do and left the bird to its craft. I reached the basin rim where the white relented and colors returned as if painted in with a thin brush. The hum fell away until it was no more than the memory of a song you cannot rid yourself of after leaving a hall. I turned once to look back. The pass wore its cloud like a sleep mask. The notch hid itself completely. In my mouth, I tasted a last hint of salt that could have come from sweat. I did not decide the source. I followed the scrawls that write safety when a day chooses to let you keep it, and I let the wind have the last word in my back. The hymn did not stop. It learned to be quiet. Down by memory began like most descents that pretend to be easy. I left the saddle with the axe high on the shaft and the case strapped flat so the day would keep its quiet. The past stayed behind me under wool, and the hum dwindled into the kind of ringing you get after leaving a loud room. The valley drew its old shapes on the world again, honest curves and dark thread lines of water cutting the snow the way a pen finds a margin. I let the map live under the jacket and used the track I have walked in summers when the tussock shows you where to lift your feet so you do not turn an ankle on someone else's weather. The snow had taken those lessons for itself and written them in gloss and grain. I tried to read them without believing I knew the story. The radio muttered once and slept. I did not trouble it. My gloves knew the weight of the axe and my shoulders knew the slope's suggestion, and for a while the work was simple. Then distance changed its behavior again. A stand of manuka that should sit a short stroll away kept its small silhouettes just out of reach at the pace of a dream where you never quite arrive. When I turned to check my own tracks, the line behind me bore a subtle mischief, a drift of steps a hand's width off the angle I thought I had held. Wind writes more than scrawls. It writes you if you let it. I corrected with a small, insulted pride, and chose a rib of schist that would not rewrite me so easily. In the low country's lip, a lopsided cairn hunkers into the earth, stones with old lichen that a summer party stacked long ago when the markers were thin and goodwill did the rest. I counted on that small bulge of rock the way you count on a friend you do not write to enough. It should have been to my left, by a pleasant stretch. It appeared on my right with the sort of casual confidence that makes a person wish they had drawn their own map from memory rather than the printed one. I touched the top stone with a glove and found it cold in the way only river-washed rock gets, as if a hand had soaked it and set it there minutes ago. I did not smell water. I smelled a faint tide. The case under my jacket stayed quiet, respectable, professional. My teeth found a whisper anyway, and I pressed the jaw shut on it. I took duty as a line. The signage I had promised to check lives along a spur that loses itself to scrub and is found again by those who already know it. In seasons with grass, I carry the measure for post replacements and a small roll of hazard tape that never reads as dramatic as it looks. In winter, I carry the memory of where a person learns to take a breath and wait for the wind to finish telling lies before choosing which foot goes first. I reached the spur's shoulder by counting the changes in the surface under my soles, gloss to squeak to velvet to packed tile and back, until the pattern matched what my knees have known longer than they care to admit. There the snow thinned, and the scrub raised black fingers through white. The soft light made those fingers seem to move. I did not name the trick. I named the plants to keep the mind honest. The first signpost stood with a tilt that belonged to frost working on the footings rather than neglect. A corner of the reflective plate had lifted where a tack had given up, and it chattered in the light wind like a bird with nothing pressing to say. I tightened what I could reach and added a tie that would keep the metal from learning to talk all winter. While I worked, the radio stirred itself and gave me a lone click that I have only heard from it when a distant transmission tries and fails to arrive with dignity. I waited. Nothing else came. I learned again the patient truth that not every call is sent to be heard. Past the first sign, the spur steepened, offering a choice between a sheltered slot that collects winter like a habit and a scoured flank where boot rubber will outlive snow. I took the flank and found my way by the acquaintance of small marks that summer rain writes into grit. Those marks do not belong to winter, and yet they spoke in my mind with the clarity of dry months. I let them act as a rope thrown backward through seasons and held the throw tight. Halfway down, the wind turned its face toward me and leaned with a steady hand against the chest. It did not shove. It suggested. The suggestion aimed not for the route I wanted, but for a line a little off, toward a shallow hollow where summer water rests before it decides itself. In snow, that hollow is a lesson. It makes a bridge that looks honest and is not. I felt the pull and let duty run the other boot. I gave a child's nod toward the hollow to keep peace with the air, and then took the safe line, because the cost of satisfying both would be paid by the next party if I made the wrong story. Once I reached the second sign, the work turned plain. Its pole had creaked where the bracket had loosened, but the hardware still remembered how to make itself useful. I set the wrench where it needed to be, and the metal gave in with a tidy honesty that warmed the fingers through the gloves. I stamped a small platform with the flat of the boot, so the next person will not stand in a slanted way, and told myself a day had been made dull again. That is the point of such days. While I stood there with a pocket full of good little just done, the The map case found a quiet thread that bypassed the plastic in the jacket and lived instead along the bones of the jaw and the bridge of the nose. It pointed uphill toward the pass and lower toward the shadow of a willow that should not be here and yet was, a stunted thing hunkered in the protection of boulders. Leaves shivering, though there was not enough wind on my cheek to explain it. The leaves sounded like paper turning. I ignored the willow and turned my back to it. I took 2 steps, and then I felt the air behind me change the way a room does when someone enters without speaking. I turned, because there are times when one ignores changes, and times when doing so is a kind of vanity. The willow kept its shiver, a small rope hung in its branches, a remnant from summer crews trailing the line when Workup Valley asks for a handhold at a crossing. That rope lifted and fell in the wind, as if it had learned the pass's hymn, and now wanted to hum along. I did not indulge that thought. I took the rope down, coiled it, and tucked it at the base of the trunk where it could not write invitations to anyone passing. As I stood from the crouch, the smell of kelp walked past with company, tar, algae, and the sweet faint breath of a harbor at slack water. I had not taken off my pack. I felt the weight press as the air leaned. The safer spur down lay left. The path by memory ran right through a boulder field you know better than a person should admit. In long daylight with dry rock, the field is a piano. Step where the song tells you. In winter, the song lies and pretends the keys are there when they are not. I picked the safer spur and committed in my gut so I would not be tempted to test both and learn nothing. The wind respected the choice enough to fall to a background murmur, and the case was silent under wool. A Kia flashed slate and green at the corner of my sight and let out a loud laugh that made me smile despite the day. It landed on a rock the size of a stove and poked at the rubber on my boot with a professional interest that birds and weather share. I shooed it with a tilt of the head, and it went, not far, and then called back with a note that matched the tone I had been trying not to give authority. I asked the bird aloud if it intended to draw a map for me. It tilted its head as if to say it had already done that. I reached a creek scar where snow had slumped into a slow slide earlier in the season, and set a plank of crossed debris that someone smarter than me had cached on the bank in warmer months. The plank held with the small honesty of materials that know their limits. I crossed and felt that simple victory land in the muscles like grace. On the far side, I found a set of prints, narrow and deliberate, where someone had passed a day or 2 ago. The edges were softened by spindrift, but a small detail made me halt. The prints were mine. They matched the soles I wore, the rhythm of my stride, the slight outward toe on the right boot I have pretended does not exist since it first appeared. They led forward toward the safer spur, and then veered to that wrong side where the hollow asks for trust. I stood and watched a thought try to form and then fail. I checked the low shrub beside the track. A broken twig carried a smear of green that could have been made by any boot at any time. I placed my foot beside the print and did not step into it. I left my own new line a hand's width to the safe side, and watched the wind lift the old edge as if it had been never there. By the time I gained the shoulder where the shelter roof peeks out, light had lowered into the valley in that particular way that makes sound clearer and shapes sultan. The roof flashed dull tin through the manuka, and the door looked the way a door looks when it has learned patience waiting for a ranger who knows better than to be late. I felt the cost of the day in my wrists and across the forearm, where the case strap had driven a narrow ache into the muscle. I tasted salt even with no wind on my lips. I knew I would write a clean report that left a space white where a story could go if a head were not on duty. I knew also that I would sleep with the bivy sack unrolled close, not because I needed it now, but because I wanted something to be ready that had no opinion of maps or air. At the shelter, I set the pack down with that care you only give things that have earned it. I warmed my hands on the small stove the way people do when they pretend it is just another day. The radio made its throat clear and Base asked for a last check. I answered in language that passes without raising eyebrows. Work complete. Visibility changing. Wind variable. Recommend avoiding the throat near the pass until loading settles. I did not name the notch, the song, the salt, or the way my own tracks had learned to leave me before I left them. The reply thanked me and asked me to rest and come out at first light. I said yes. The roof lifted a fraction, then settled as the gust found it. The door lifted the latch and set it down like a tired thought. Sleep did not come quickly. When it did, it came with a sound in the teeth that matched no stove and no kettle. I dreamed of lines that know they are lines, and of maps that hum to their owners until the decision costs enough to become true. When I woke in the small hours, the wind had gone somewhere else to sing. The night smelled of wet wood and old metal, and only the faintest memory of tide. I turned on my side and faced the pack, the way one faces a companion who will not judge, and I promised the day to write what I could and carry what I could not. Morning would make its own argument. The past would lift its wool and pretend innocence. Memory would do the guiding, because the world had practiced the trick of moving under paper, and I needed something that could move with it without giving its reasons. Night began without ceremony. The valley quieted itself until every sound felt chosen, and the shelter roof took on that patient thrum that says the wind has not left, only learned to speak softer. I made the small meals a ranger makes when the day has already priced the body and the mind has not agreed to rest. Then I cleaned the stove and stacked what needed stacking, because order is a kind of heat. When I stepped out, the sky above the manuka was the color of old tin, and the pass wore its wool in a darker fold. I told Base I would take a short walk to check for drift creep below the spur, a simple patrol that would keep the morning party from walking into a quiet trap. The reply arrived with a yawn tucked into professionalism and a request to stay within voice. I said yes and clipped the radio where the cord would not tease the antenna. The PLB sat where my hand knew to find it. The axe found my palm like it remembered me. Snow at night carries a different mind. It does not lie louder, it lies cleaner. I set out along the safer spur, keeping the case flat against the chest to starve the song. My headlamp made a small cone that did less good than a person hopes and more good than they need if they remember how to read shadow. The beam found old boot lines and small ripples where wind had rubbed the drifts to a smooth grain. Somewhere high above, the pass exhaled a long measure that took time to arrive, the sound of distance traveling at the pace of cold. I listened and let the heart find its steadier tempo, then moved. I climbed only enough to give the slope a chance to tell me what it planned to do in the dark. The wind at this hour had turned companionable, a steady hand at the back rather than a will in the jaw. I knelt and set the axe spike into the crust, then ran a palm across the surface with the glove off until the cold made its case, and then retreated into numbness. Under the skin a faint vibration arrived, not the bright kettle note of the day, but a slower chord, a room tone. I rotated the wrist toward the pass and the chord deepened by a hair. Toward the notch it thinned and sharpened like string drawn tighter. I put the glove back on and pretended that knowledge had no power. My plan was simple. Set a series of quiet flags down the line a morning crew would take, note any tension in the drifts, and return before the pass remembered its hymn. I placed the first flag where the surface had the honest squeak of packed tile and moved on. At the second, I felt the ground give a patient sigh and then accept the foot, the way an elder forgives a small misstep. I took that as a warning. I cut a short detour across a rib of scoured snow that had gathered mica like a dry riverbed gathers silt. When I stopped to mark the correction on the mental map I carry, the air discovered a narrow seam at the edge of the case and wrote a soft line through it. Barely sound, mostly pressure along the teeth. I covered the seam with the jacket and let the night quiet again. Halfway to the old cairn, the smell came. It rose in a thin tide and settled just as thin, as if the sea were breathing through cloth. Kelp, rope tar, and the dulled iron of chain, tucked inside the cold so that a person could pretend it was only a memory they had carried from other work. I held still and learned where the air wanted to lead the nose. It pointed not toward the valley's river, but upslope, toward a hollow that in summer holds meltwater and in winter holds lessons. I do not follow scent in white work. I mark it as a breadcrumb and let the boots choose the tasks the job owns. I set a flag on the shoulder above that hollow and recorded in quiet speech what another ranger would need to hear without hearing my ghost. Avoid depression beyond first shoulder. Wind loading uncertain. The radio took the note and did not answer, which is the best kind of agreement at this hour. I turned to start back when the night misbehaved in a small way that carried weight. My own tracks behind me had shifted a fraction toward the wrong line, as if the wind had leaned down and nudged them before they set. I stepped into one to test the depth. The edge crumbled as if it had been made of brushed salt. The next held, then slumped a little with a sound like paper bending. I let the axe shaft speak to the layer beneath. The undersurface answered in two voices, one low and calm under the rib, one thin and impatient where the hollow began its bad persuasion. I placed a final flag at the boundary and gave it a tug to feel its temper. It held like a small truth. On the way down, I skirted the willow I had neatened earlier. Its leaves stirred without a breeze I could feel. The coil of rope I had tucked beneath now lay crooked, as if a hand had shifted it to look under. I knelt and lifted the coil to find a scatter of grit pressed into the snow in a pattern like tiny chevrons pointing upslope. Wind draws that sign on sand flats. On this bank, it told me less about intent than about habit. I brushed the grit aside and set the coil firmer, reminded again that the valley can learn ideas from the heights if a line connects them strong enough. I stood, and the radio speaker made the small throat sound of a signal born and abandoned, then offered silence. When bass finally broke in, the voice was faint with distance and the hour. A quick check, then bed, came the request. I agreed and promised first light out of the basin. The shelter door took me back without fuss. I shook the ice from the axe and leaned it where it would dry in a sensible way. The case I wiped with a cloth and laid on the bunk beside the bivy, so nothing would be between them and my hand if the night chose to test its price. Sleep found me in a stuttering way, each drift of rest interrupted by the radio's little stirrings and by a noise that lived in the teeth more than the ear. I dreamed that lines on maps are wires strung between hills, and that wind plays them when crews sleep. The song in the dream did not frighten. It chose notes that meant not threat, but counting. When I woke before dawn, the hut smelled of damp wool and solder, and only the faintest echo of tide. First light in early winter is not light so much as a decision the sky makes to give you edges again. I ate quickly, checked the straps, and shouldered the pack with a gratitude you only feel for weight when it comes as work rather than as loss. Base kept their word and came through bright with expectation. They wanted me down by the trail end by late morning, or earlier if the pass argued. I said I would meet the day where it kept the road plain. I did not mention that the night had moved a few simple things out of place. Out in the gray, I walked the line of flags I had set and found each upright, convinced and ready to help a person keep their day. I added 2 more where the wind had deposited a fresh, small lip that would trip a tired foot. Then I turned the shoulder that leads toward the last descent and stopped because the world had made a change with the boldness of a child who thinks you were not looking. Across the basin, where yesterday the scrawls had proposed a corridor from the pass throat, the snow showed long, shallow channels as if water had run a hand over it in the night. No water had. Each channel pointed toward the notch I had not named on the radio. The lines were too tidy for accident, too soft for ice that had broken and fallen, too continuous for the casual work of gusts. The wind had spent the night writing. I stood with the axe in the snow and the case under the jacket and chose to call the writing a drift artifact in the log I would deliver. In my body, I called it a map. I began the last stretch down. The Kia saw me and flew long across the field of light, calling with the 2 notes and the laugh that had threaded my work since morning. It landed ahead and bobbed on stiff legs, then tilted its head toward the notch, though the bird had no business knowing where that sat. I shooed it with a word, and it rose, flashing green and slate, crossing over the new channels without a shadow. The smell of salt lifted once from the hollow, and was gone. I kept my line true and clean, and let the channels slide along my left like a companion I do not name in public. At the shelter I wrote what I could. Drift behavior complex near pass saddle. Avoid throat adjacent to notch. Flag set on safe line. Signage tended. Bivy latch secured up valley. I left space where the other account would have lived if a person were free to print what wind writes. I closed the log with the kind of calm a ranger uses to put the day away. Then I packed the bivy, checked the PLB, hefted the axe, and tightened the case strap until the ribs knew it. When I stepped out, the pass had shaved a little wool from its brow and let a clean band of sky show like a healed scar. The song did not follow me into the trees. It stayed where maps lift their voices. Ahead lay the trail end, and the face I would wear when Base asked how ordinary the day had been. Behind, the night's protocol lived in muscle, and in a promise I had not decided to make. Morning gathered itself without hurry, the way a careful hand folds a map it respects. I set out with the pack cinched and the case pressed flat, planning a plain exit through the lower scrub and out to the trail end where the vehicle would wait with mud on its flanks and a heater that makes you grateful for small mercies. The pass sat behind like a closed ledger you are not finished with. I kept my breath even and let the flags I had planted through the night do the work I would have asked of a partner. They stood in their places with a confidence that felt borrowed from a steadier season. The wind was kind for a span, then fickle, then absent in a way that made me miss its company despite everything it had said. I moved into the manuka fringe and the world shifted gears. Snow broke into patches that hid among tawny stems, and the ground underfoot changed grammar every few paces, from coarse glitter to damp sponge to skin of ice that chose when to forgive. I adjusted the stride to meet it all like a neighbor you plan to see again. The radio carried a check from base, brisk with daylight and the comfort of desks. I reported flag sound, drift complicated but controlled, visibility improving, intent to exit on the prescribed line. I did not mention the channels the wind had carved above, or the way the case seemed lighter when my shoulders faced the notch even with the strap unchanged. The reply praised proper procedure and asked for a quick call once I hit the trail end. I put the handset away and felt the weight of that promise settle against the ribs. At the creek flats the land opened, and I could see the low cut of the exit track, threading through scrub and boulder toward the dim shape of a gate. Fog along the water wore itself thin, and the sunlight, such as it was, made the stones wear a glaze that looked warmer than it felt. I had the choice of an easy ford across shallow braids or an older footbridge a short way down where summer crews once set planks that sometimes hold through winter. The braids looked honest in a way that tempts. The bridge meant a mild detour and the admission that I would protect boots and knees even if the day thought me cautious to a fault. I decided for the braids, then changed the mind that had made that decision. I do not like when the wind writes my name on a slope. I like even less when it writes it on water. The detour began well enough. I followed a deer track where the snow had receded, and the ground showed damp leaf and stone like a welcoming hand. Then the track looped toward a hollow I had measured in the dark, and asked me to cross where a shallow slide had cooled and stiffened. I tested with the axe and listened. The echo came back dull and well-behaved. I stepped, and the surface sagged, not dangerously, only with the confidence of an old mattress that knows how to hold a sleeper and still insist on a price in the joints come morning. I took that warning and put the boot on the scoured rib instead. The rib carried me to the top of a small bluff where the creek cut deeper and ran with a sound that makes a person remember harbors even when they have never worked a harbor in their life. The bridge stood a short distance down, a pale line of timber, weathered and straight at a glance. As I approached, the wind rose in a clean breath from the upstream bend, and with it came the tide smell that should have been too shy to travel under this much earth and stone. Rope tar, kelp, the chain breath of anchors, all braided thin and insistent. The plank ends lifted a whisper, then settled as the gust passed. I set the axe, tested the first slat, and read the give. It had learned patience. I placed the second step, and the plank answered with a small knock underfoot that traveled the length of the span and back again as if the structure were a throat. I held the handline and waited for it to quiet. When it did, I tried again and put weight forward only by the width of a palm. The knock returned, a little faster now, and fell away like a conversation that decides it will not follow you out the door. I crossed without hurry, the way one handles an argument that does not belong to them. On the far bank, the wind had prepared a message. A line of drift had come down from the slope, not much. Only a thin fan that stopped Teddy against a boulder, turned sidewise from its cousins. The top of the fan had the faint sheen of a beach when a wave draws back and leaves rope marks. I reached to brush the surface and felt the cold bite with the astringent sting of dried salt. The boulder under my palm felt wet without being wet. I do not insist on fitting every line into a story. I fitted this one into a bag I carry for truths that belong to the field and not to paper, then turned away from it because the day was not done, and I was not paid to stand and stare. The exit track narrowed through scrub. Branches tugged at the pack with that petty malice only plants and weather can claim without apology. The case rested quiet. The axe loosened the little aches that collect in wrist and forearm, an old comfort. I moved with the calm of a person nearing the end of a shift, when a small thing went wrong in the exact scale that teaches humility. The track under my boot slid sideways on a seam of wet clay where a spring had been working. My weight went with it. I set the axe to check the skid, and the pick skated across root and missed the soil by a hair. I dropped with my hip against a stump, the breath driven out without insult, and heard a quick, tender snap from the pack lid. The map case strap had given up at the seam. The case hit the ground on its corner, and the sleeve, finally free to speak, opened enough to let a clean, thin note ring out that matched the notch's key even here among scrub and bird noise and the friendly stink of damp earth. I pressed the case shut with a hand that was not steady. The song stopped. I lay there with cheek against bark and tasted salt. It might have been sweat. It might have been the day saying it would see me again. I sat up and ran a hand over the hip where the stump had signed its name. No break, only a bruise that would ripen and inform me each time I bent for a week or more. I checked the beacon where it lives. The cap was still seated, the lanyard unfrayed, the button where a clumsy thumb could find it without error. I kept the radio quiet. I sewed the strap back into service with cord from the repair kit, the kind of tidy job you can manage when you accept that a cheap fix will become the true fix for longer than intended. The case looked wrong after, functional and honest and marked. I took the lesson. I would replace it at base and carry this one as a spare, because things that have learned a song are sometimes best kept near but not in charge. The last stretch to the trail end asked nothing dramatic. It asked for knees that forgive and a neck that knows when to turn to listen for a branch above. The wind stayed with me, subdued as if it had decided to be polite in front of trees. When the gate showed through manuka and fern, I let the body believe in endings. The vehicle sat dull and patient, the way good tools wait. I leaned the axe against the bumper and stood with my hands on the roof to take the cold out of the fingers and to feel something that did not move unless I asked it. Base answered on the first call and sounded relieved in that professional way that does not make a fuss. I reported exit, signage tended, flags placed, drift near pass complex, throat by notch to be avoided pending stability. I added a mild suggestion to amend the winter route note with an advisory that the saddle collects unusual loading this season. I did not say the wind had kept a ledger and that I had paid into it. I asked for a maintenance ticket for the far latch and a replacement strap for a case that had forgotten its manners. The reply gave me numbers I will not write here and a time to file the written report. I said I would be in on the dot, then ended the call and sat with the door open to let the outside finish its sentence. I could leave the story there, with the heater rattling toward warm and the road offering its plain kindness. The cost of the day lay where I would feel it, painted across a hip and threaded through a forearm where a strap had chewed. The other cost is harder to place on a shelf. It lives in the part of the mind that holds maps as more than paper and wind as more than weather. The pass will call again in a week or in a year, and I will go because that is the job, and because the hills are a language I am still learning in a responsible way. I will carry a new case and an old spare, and I will fold the map with care, and I will keep duty as a line that refuses the stories one would like to write inside it. I will also, when the cloud sits and the air hums along the teeth, place my palm on the snow and let the mountains speak in a grammar I will not record and cannot forget. That is a cost I accept without receipt. I started the engine and let it idle while I packed the axe, stowed the beacon in its spot, and checked the radio one last time. The Kia called from somewhere behind the shrubs with the usual laugh, then a single clean note I had heard before. I smiled because a day that gives you that sound and lets you bring home a report with more routine than myth is a day you respect. As I pulled away, the wind came down the valley and moved through the manuka so that the leaves sounded like paper turned in a careful hand. I did not look back at the pass. The ledger is balanced for now, not closed. In the mirror, the scrub folded behind like a quiet audience leaving a hall. Ahead, the road met the river, and then the coast far off where the smell belongs. I carried the song in the jaw and left it unsung.